Elizabeth, a literary princess. If you are new here, welcome. I'm a 6-year PhD candidate in English literature with a focus on Victorian women novelists. And as you might expect, I love to read. Today I have another Victober video for you, and I thought that it would be fun to talk about my absolute favorite Victorian author, Margaret Oliphant. So I have read 14 works by Oliphant. That is novels, 15 works. That is novels, short stories, and an autobiography. And that is a fraction of what she wrote. So for fiction, she has a total of 176 pieces of fiction. 98 of those are novels. You can do the math for the short stories. I can't do math. She also has several biographies and historical works that she wrote, and just tons of articles. Tons, like uncountable articles. And then, of course, her autobiography. So she was obviously an incredibly prolific writer, and one of my dissertation authors, because that is what I am dealing with, prolific Victorian women novelists. So I thought it would be fun to give a little bit of history about her, talk about the books that I have read by her, and then talk about a few of the books that I want to read by her. So let's jump in. Oliphant was born Margaret Oliphant Wilson on April 4th, 1828 in Oliphant, Scotland. So she was Scottish. She did eventually move to England, where she spent most of her life. Her first book was published in 1849 by Henry Colburn. It was The Passages in the Life of Mrs. Margaret Maitland of Sunnyside, and it is narrated by an older Scottish woman named Margaret Maitland, and is a story of family. I've not read this one. I do want to. I would love to read all of her books in like chronological order, but good Lord, that's a tall task. Between writing Margaret Maitland and marrying her husband in 1852, she published 7 more books, and on the morning of her wedding, she received the proofs for Katie Stewart, the 8th book, which was the first of hers to be published with Blackwoods. Again, another one that I have not read yet, but that I do want to. She was married to her cousin, Frank Oliphant, so she became Margaret Oliphant Wilson Oliphant, and yes, that is how she signed herself. Frank was an artist, mainly working with stained glass. They had 3 living children together. Unfortunately, they did have several children that passed in infancy. Those children were their one daughter, Maggie, and 2 sons, Cyril, and one named Francis after his father, but whom they called Checo. Fortunately, their marriage did not last very long. In 1859, during a trip to Italy, Frank died of tuberculosis, leaving Oliphant the sole provider for her children. It is at this point that she started writing some of her most popular works, the Chronicles of Carlingford, which we will talk about later. Unfortunately, tragedy was just kind of the main theme of Oliphant's life. Her daughter Maggie passed away, also in Rome in 1864. Rome did not have good connotations for Oliphant, as you can imagine. And shortly after that, her brother, who lived in Canada, went bankrupt, and she became responsible for providing for his children. She also had another brother, I believe Henry is his name, and he was an alcoholic, and she was kind of constantly dealing with him too. So she had a pretty big financial burden on her. So it makes sense that she wrote as much as she did, because she is trying to support all these people as basically the one competent adult in the entire extended family. Unfortunately, she was not yet done with tragedy. Cyril passed away in 1890 and Checo in 1894. So she survived her husband and all of her children. She did not pass away until June 20th of 1897 at the age of 69, and she was pretty much writing and publishing until the very end. So one obituary of her said that there were two women that defined the Victorian era: Queen Victoria and Margaret Oliphant. And in a way, they're very similar women. Queen Victoria was about 10 years older, but died only a few years after Oliphant. Oliphant actually died just before, I guess it was the Diamond Jubilee for Victoria. They were both widowed, and they were both very associated with domesticity. So most of what Oliphant wrote would be in the category of domestic realism, but she did occasionally go outside of that. She had a lot of popular supernatural stories, and she did engage in the occasional sensation novel, despite the fact that she despised the genre, which you can see in her reviews of Mary Elizabeth Braddon's work. She is very harsh on Braddon. She did like Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, but that's basically the only one she liked by him. We will talk more about her sensation forays when we get to Salem Chapel. So let's talk about the books I've read by her. First of these is The Ethelings, published from June 1856 to June 1857 in Blackwoods Magazine, and then put out in 3 volumes. This is the story of a woman writer, remarkably like Oliphant herself, who writes in the midst of her family and gets a book published and has it be kind of an immediate hit, which is similar to what happened with Margaret Maitland. The novel takes a very big turn from Oliphant's life. That is just kind of the beginning of the novel, and she has used her life for the inspiration of the starting point. I personally really like this novel. You can tell it's an early work, and sometimes there's a lot going on, and sometimes the connections between everything are a bit loose, but it's ultimately a lot of fun. There is unfortunately no print edition that I know of, so it can be read online on Internet Archive. There is a website called the Margaret Oliphant Fiction Collection that is at oliphantfiction.com, and they have links to all of her novels and short stories for you to read online. So this website is an absolute blessing to me. So the next ones that I have read in the chronological order are the first 3 stories of the Chronicles of Carlingford. These are The Executor, The Rector, and The Doctor's Family, each published in Blackwoods in 1861. So the story of The Executor is that Oliphant's husband had just died. She really needed money to support herself and her children, and Blackwoods just wasn't accepting any of her stories or articles. So after getting another thing rejected by them, she went home and she just started writing off this story and submitted it. It got accepted, and it became her best-selling series. She talks about this in her autobiography. The Chronicles of Carlingford all deal with various members of society in this small town. The Executor deals with a matter of inheritance, the Rector with Mr. Proctor, who is the new clergyman and who doesn't really feel that he is called to work in this capacity. And then the Doctor's Family is the story of Edward Ryder and his troubles with his alcoholic brother and the brother's wife, children, and sister-in-law who show up on Edward's doorstep when he did not even know they existed. Yes. I'm not going to give huge summaries of each of these books because we'll be here forever, but I'll give you a little bit of a gist. The Doctor's Family is particularly amazing. Really, really good. Nettie Underwood, my favorite character. But you do need to read The Executor and The Rector first, and really you just need to read The Executor before reading The Doctor's Family, but The Rector is important for more other stories in the Chronicles of Carlingford. I highly suggest reading these in order, even though I didn't. You'll have a better time. Next up, we have another chronicle of Carlingford. This is Salem Chapel, published in Blackwoods Magazine from February 1862 to January of 1863, and then put out in 2 volumes in 1863. This is Margaret Oliphant's little foray into sensation fiction. It tells the story of Arthur Vincent, the new dissenting minister of Salem Chapel in Carlingford, and he realizes that he's not really big on his congregation. He aspires to higher things. In the meantime, there is this mysterious Mrs. Hilliard who is clearly hiding some things. Vincent's sister gets dragged into this, and it is a whole affair. So, I do want to talk a little bit more about this one because I do write about it in my dissertation. A lot of people, 20th century critics, and even 21st century critics, feel that Salem Chapel and the sensation plot of it was just Oliphant trying to appeal to readers and make more money. I do not agree with that. I actually view Salem Chapel itself as a critique of sensation fiction and kind of showing the big struggle of the day between realism and genre fiction that was going on. And ultimately, Oliphant sees realism as winning out. She did not like sensation fiction. She actually worried in a letter to her publisher that this would be too sensational. So yeah, I think people have seriously misread this book over the years. It's a lot of fun. It's not my favorite of hers, but it's definitely a good time, and I've read it twice, and I'm perfectly happy to have. But yes, terribly misread over the years. Next up is another chronicle of Carlingford. I think I actually, in the chronological order, I don't have any others between them, even though she wrote plenty between them. This is The Perpetual Curate. This was published in Blackwoods between June 1863 and September 1864, and then put out in 3 volumes. It was during the writing of this that Oliphant's daughter Maggie died, and that was a real blow to her because, to be honest, Maggie was her favorite child. You can tell by the way she writes about them. The only daughter, her first child, I can see why. So The Perpetual Curate tells the story of Frank Wentworth, the Perpetual Curate of St. Roch's, and a misunderstanding that occurs in the town surrounding him, as well as his relationship with Lucy Wodehouse, which is set up for in The Rector. We see Mr. Proctor again, and we have his relationship with Lucy Wodehouse's sister, whose name I'm not remembering right now. This kind of has another little foray into sensation, but it is very much played for laughs instead of, serious. This book is very funny. Frank has these 3 aunts who are hysterical. So, great time. Excellent book. And then we get to Miss Marchbanks, which is my favorite of Oliphant's works. This was published in Blackwoods from February 1865 to May of 1866. It tells the story of Lucilla Marchbanks and her conquering of Carlingford society. I always say Lucilla is what Emma Woodhouse from Jane Austen's Emma wants to be. So she is Emma, but more competent. And it's true. She knows how to just talk to people and get exactly what she wants. She gets her guy elected into Parliament. She climbs to the top of Carlingford society. Her Thursday evenings are the place to be. She sets trends. She is just everything. I love this. It is very kind of dry sarcasm, I guess. It is very much social satire, and I think it rubs people the wrong way sometimes because it is kind of more pointed than her other works. This was written right after the death of her daughter. She was not in a great headspace, although she managed to write a fantastic book, so okay. But it is sharper than her others, and her publisher actually noted that in some letters to her. But, my favorite. Then we have a huge jump, like of 10 years, where I haven't read anything by her until we get to the last chronicle of Carlingford, Phoebe Jr. This was published by Hurst and Blackett in 1876, making it the only chronicle of Carlingford not to be published by Blackwoods. She offered it to them, they did not want it. Blackwoods at this point in her career kind of felt like her popularity was waning a bit and was kind of drawing off publishing her novels. So this tells the story of Phoebe Beecham, who is the granddaughter of some characters we met in Salem Chapel. She comes to Carlingford to take care of her grandparents, who are elderly, and she becomes involved with the children of the Anglican Church's minister, despite the fact that she is from a dissenting family. Phoebe is another wonderful, practical, gets what she wants woman. Love her. I would say this is probably my second favorite. The Doctor's Family is probably my second favorite in the Chronicles of Carlingford. This is my third favorite in the Chronicles of Carlingford. Then we have another bit of a time jump to 1883 with Hester, which was published by Macmillan and Company. This is the story of a young woman whose cousin or aunt or something, I don't actually know their relationship, but this cousin slash aunt slash whatever she is Catherine Vernon, who runs her family's bank because the men are all useless. Hester and her mother are now kind of under the charity care of Catherine Vernon. And the two of them clash heads because they are very much alike in that they are practical, capable, and not really wanting to just be in the traditional domestic role that women played in the Victorian period. This book is excellent. I need to reread this one. I haven't read it in a while. Back of this calls it Oliphant's masterpiece in psychological realism, and it's really good. Very easily comparable to things by George Eliot, and deserves love. Deserves so much love, although this is definitely one of Oliphant's that gets more love than others. And the next one I have in a collection of two novellas, and it is not the title one, so I'm just gonna... This is... You probably can't see it. This is Queen Eleanor and Fair Rosamond, published in 1886 in Cornhill magazine. It is one of her short pieces of fiction. It is published by Persephone Books together with The Mystery of Mrs. Blencarrow, which we will talk about in a minute. And this is kind of a modern, meaning Victorian, because that's what was modern at the time, retelling of the legend of Henry II's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine? I don't know how that's pronounced. And his mistress, Rosamond, who Eleanor finds out about and kills. This follows the Landon family, and Mr. Landon is acting pretty sketchy lately, so Mrs. Landon decides that she's gonna find out what's going on. I think what's nice about this one, and it is also nice about The Mystery of Mrs. Blencarrow, is it deals with characters who are older. They're not these young 18-year-olds who are just falling in love and getting married. These are people who have been married for a while. So it's nice to get away from that more traditional plot surrounding the young characters who are falling in love. Next up we have Mr. Sandford, which was also published in Cornhill magazine from April to May of 1888. This was later collected into the collection The Ways of Life, which is where I read it. in 1897. So Mr. Sandford tells the story of an artist who is realizing that his style is going out and that his works are no longer selling. I think at this point, Oliphant is writing very autobiographically. In the later years of the Victorian period, her style of fiction was not as popular as it used to be. And especially her main thing was the 3-volume novel. The 3-volume novel really started to fail in the late 1880s into the 1890s. So I think this is very reflective of how she was feeling about her own career and life. The next one is The Mystery of Mrs. Blencarrow, which was published in the Manchester Weekly Times from November 30th to December 28th, 1889. Mrs. Blencarrow is a widow and has been for quite a while. She has a few children. She's highly respected in the neighborhood. When a young neighborhood couple elopes to Gretna Green, they notice in the marriage register Mrs. Blencarrow's name, along with a name of someone else who is not Mr. Blencarrow. And this date of it is quite recent. This, of course, causes the rumor mill to start churning, and it's a whole scandal. This is a really good one. I liked this one a lot. Again, it's nice to look at these older characters and what they're doing. Same with Mr. Sandford, dealing with a more middle-aged character. So, highly recommend The Mystery of Mrs. Blencarrow. We then have the other book that was published in The Ways of Life in 1897. This is The Strange Story of Mr. Robert Dalyell, and it was published originally in Cornhill Magazine from January to March of 1892. I'm not going to say anything about this one. I've said it before when talking about it. Anything is a spoiler. Just read it. It's so good. Just read it. We are now to the last of Oliphant's fiction that I have read. This is The Library Window, originally published in Blackwoods in January of 1896. It is one of her supernatural short stories. It was then collected in the Stories of the Seen and Unseen in 1902 after her death. This is creepy. This is really weird. It is narrated by a young girl who is spending some time with her aunt in St. Rules, and she starts seeing a guy in the window of the library across the street. Except nobody else seems to think that this is a window. She's the only one that can see into it. And that is all I will say. This is fantastic. This is a great one. I need to read more of her supernatural stuff because I loved this. And it's definitely worth picking up. If it's your first time reading Margaret Oliphant, this is a good one to go with if you don't want to go for a full novel. And now we get to her autobiography. This was first published as The Autobiography and Letters of Mrs. M.O.W. Oliphant. It was edited by her cousin, Annie Coghill, or Mrs. Harry Coghill, as she was credited, and published in 1899. Now, the text of what is published here is not exactly the text that Oliphant wrote in the autobiography. She began the autobiography in 1864 upon the death of her daughter. And those first few entries are pretty much entirely scrapped in the first published edition of the autobiography. She then picked up writing again in the 1880s and frequently went years without writing anything in it. So Coghill kind of rearranged things to put it in more chronological order. She took out a lot of very personal parts about the grief over Maggie and the grief over Cyril and Checo when they passed. And sometimes would just like inexplicably add a little piece from one of the 1864 entries to like one of the 1880s or 1890s entries. It was really weird. It's very interesting. Apparently, Oliphant did leave a note for whoever ended up editing it, So Coghill and also Denny Oliphant, one of Oliphant's nieces, were the ones who put it together and everything. And the note told them that they could cut this stuff if they wanted to, and to take out anything else that they thought might be better to remove. They removed several comments about other notable Victorians who were still alive, most notably Leslie Stephen, the father of Virginia Woolf, although they left all the ones about the people that were already dead. So she calls George Eliot a dull woman. And from Dinah Mullet Craig, she was like, yeah, my work was better than hers. I'm like, if you're trying to like make it look like she's not shit talking people, at least cut all of it. But no, the George Eliot being a dull woman truly gets me. So in 1990, the scholar Elizabeth Jay edited a new edition of the autobiography of Margaret Oliphant, which restored all the original text. Had it in the correct order, had everything there, and it is really interesting to compare the two. This is also something that I've worked with in my dissertation. So, there's all 15 of the works by her that I've read. I truly think that her writing style is just fantastic. She is funny when she wants to be funny, but there are some truly like emotional scenes in some of these books. I just think she's so worth checking out and deserves so much more love than she gets, although she is getting a lot more love lately. The 1990s brought in a kind of rediscovery of Margaret Oliphant, so Elizabeth Jay being one of the people leading the charge. So she's gotten a lot more attention, and there are people who consider her a canonical novelist now, or at least a minor canonical novelist. I think she should be right up there with George Eliot, personally. George Eliot, the dull woman. I can't agree that George Eliot was dull, having read a biography of her, but I can see where Oliphant would get that impression sometimes. So what are some of Oliphant's books that I really want to read next? The one that I want to read next year, which I was going to read this year, and then I don't think it's going to happen. I already read 2 Oliphant books. It's a whole thing, but it's fine. This is The Ladies Lindores, which is a really tongue-twisting title, I'll be honest. This was published in Blackwoods from April of 1882 to May of 1883. And it is a story of Scotland featuring a guy whose name, John Erskine, inherits a house up in Scotland, and while he is there, he meets the Ladies Lindores, Edith, Caroline, and their mother, Lady Lindores. I don't know anything about it other than that. I've just heard from other scholars that it is really good, and I want to give it a try. Another that I really want to get to is a short story, The Open Door, which was published in Blackwoods in January of 1882. This is another supernatural story. It's part of the collection, The Tales of the Seen and Stories of the Seen and Unseen, that came out in 1902. And I just love a good supernatural story, and it sounds really good. It's about Colonel Mortimer and his family who just come back from India and lease a house called Brentwood House in Edinburgh, and things happen. Things happen. I'm particularly interested in this one because Charlotte Riddle, another Victorian novelist who I work with, also has a supernatural short story called The Open Door. I'm curious to compare the two because that's just kind of interesting to me. I also really want to get to Kirstine, which was published in Macmillan's Magazine from August 1889 to August of 1890. This tells the story of a woman who runs away because her father is trying to marry her off to someone she doesn't want to marry, and she becomes a dressmaker. So it's like almost a New Woman novel, kind of, but Oliphant didn't really like the New Woman novels or the New Woman movement, but it seems like there's kind of some things there that are very similar. I've heard this one's fantastic, although Henry James didn't like it. But I'm like, Henry James, I don't care about your opinions. Anyway. But I have heard that this one's really, really good and worth the read. I also want to read Janet, the story of a governess, which was published in Ladies Pictorial from January to June of 1890. This sounds like kind of... So as you may know, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen is kind of a parody of The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, and just kind of making fun of the Gothic genre, or poking fun at the Gothic genre. It sounds like Janet is that to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, with a governess going into the house and this secret, or she thinks there's a secret, kind of like how Catherine Morland thinks that there's something going on in Northanger. So I'm just really curious to read this one and see what it's like. It is not one of her more popular ones. I don't think I have come across anyone who's read it, like not even scholars, but I'm curious just from the description of it. I'm like, interesting. And then the final one that I want to read, or I mean, I want to read a lot of them, but the final one I'm going to talk about today is The Marriage of Eleanor, which was published in Good Words from January to December of 1891 and put out in 3 volumes by Macmillan and Company in 1892. This is a story of a young woman who marries a man against everyone's advice and the consequences of it. It's just one that I'm really curious about. That's a kind of plot that I enjoy usually, or that's interesting to me. And I don't know, I'm like, I want to know what Margaret Oliphant does with it. So those are a few of the ones that I want to read by her whenever I can next. And that is Margaret Oliphant, a short biography, a discussion of the books I have read by her and the books that I want to read. Maybe someday I will do a ranking of her works, but I feel like I need to read more of them before I do that. I mean, 176 works of fiction is a lot. So 14 works of fiction and 1 piece of nonfiction. It's like such a drop in the bucket. I feel like I need more, even though she's absolutely my favorite Victorian novelist. To do a proper ranking, I think I need to read a bit more widely throughout her body of work. Let me know down in the comments below, have you read anything by Margaret Oliphant? What did you read? Did you enjoy it? Do you have any recommendations for me? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more of my bookish content. It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon for another Victober video. Bye.